my semester 4 students. For the semester, I shall be doing Thomas Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard with you all. You will find this in your CC8 paper where you shall be reading this along with Congreve and Defoe. So for all those who have already read Congreve, you will find a different kind of mood and content in the Elegy. And it's because 18th century in English literary history is an eventful period where we witness diversity and transition. So today I shall be discussing with you the pre-romantic period as the period of transition so as to contextualize Gray. I think all of you know that in 1700 William Congreve's play The Way of the World premiered. In spite of the play being a good example of the sophistication of theatrical thinking during this period, the play was not well received by the audiences of the period because the play struck many audience members as continuing the immorality of the previous decade, that is, of the Restoration comedies. The immorality in the English stage was not well received by the English audience, and Jeremy Collier's A Short View of the Immorality and Profaneness of the English Stage, published in March 1698, signaled the swelling of public opposition to the real or imposed indecency of the plays staged over the last 3 decades. I'd like to refer to 3 things in context of the period and the reception of the Restoration comedies before I proceed. The first is that the immorality of the Restoration comedies that Collier intends to point is not merely a connotation for sexually explicit nature of Restoration comedies, but also on account of the lack of poetic justice. Now, as you all know, poetic justice has a classical lineage, and the period in and around 1660s saw a revival of classical learning which reached its peak in the works of Dryden and Pope. Secondly, John Locke, the most influential philosopher of the age, who is commonly known as the father of liberalism, presented logically an analysis of how our minds function and also argued for religious tolerance and maintained that government is justified not by divine right but by a social contract that is broken if the people's natural rights are not respected. John Locke conceived of the human mind as being at birth a tabula rasa, a blank slate on which experience wrote freely and boldly, creating the individual character according to the individual experience of the world. Supposed innate qualities such as goodness or original sin had no reality. This period also saw the rise of the middle class. So it can be said that multiple strains were performing through the lives and works of the period. On one hand, we have the revival of classical learning that called for a kind of order, restraint and form. On the other, we also notice the beginning of liberalism and hence a more human atmosphere. This age was also one of reason against the dogmatism of religion, as we can see in the philosophy of Locke. In such a backdrop, Samuel Johnson comes up with his most highly regarded poem, The Vanity of Human Wishes, in 1749, which was an imitation of Juvenal's Satire 10 and claims that the antidote to vain human wishes is non-vain spiritual wishes. In particular, Johnson emphasizes the helpless vulnerability of the individual before the social context and the inevitable self-deception by which human beings are led astray. You can well understand from the consensus of reason and order, the progress was towards the individual. During this time, we also see the rise of the sentimental novel or novel of sensibility, as for instance Samuel Richardson's Pamela or Virtue Rewarded in the year 1740. It celebrated the emotional and intellectual concepts of sentiment, sentimentalism and sensibility. Sentimentalism, which is to be distinguished from sensibility, was a fashion in both poetry and prose fiction which began in reaction to the rationalism of the Augustan age. Sentimental novels relied on emotional response both from their readers and characters. Scenes of distress and tenderness are common, and the plot is arranged to advance emotions rather than actions. The result is a valorization of fine feeling, displaying the characters as models for refined, sensitive emotional effect. Sometime back from this, in the 1730s, James Thomson's The Seasons, brimming with descriptions of nature, gets published, which can be considered as the first noteworthy poem of the Romantic Revival. And finally, Rousseau, one of the most influential thinkers of the time, also was a strong influence on the period. His thought marked the end of European Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. He propelled political and ethical thinking into new channels. His reforms revolutionized taste, first in music, then in the arts. He had a profound impact on people's way of life. He taught parents to take a new interest in their children and to educate them differently. He fathered the expression of emotion rather than polite restraint in friendship and love. He introduced the cult of religious sentiment among people who had discarded religious dogma. He opened people's eyes, hence, to the beauties of nature, and he made liberty an object of almost universal aspiration. What can be said in context of the progress that I mentioned in the last slide is the movement was towards emotionalism, subjectivity, and hence, of course, individuality, which was quite contrary to the restrictive quality of the classical influences on literature. Thus, speaking through dates and history, if the first half of the 18th century was dominated by the neoclassical ideas expressed by Alexander Pope in An Essay on Criticism and An Essay on Man, the second half of the century was governed by the personality of Dr. Samuel Johnson, and an increased focus can be noticed on subjectivity and introspection that latter characterized modern writing. The second half of the 18th century is hence often termed as the Age of Johnson. So now we have reached the period which we need to understand in order to understand Gray, that is, the age of Dr. Johnson or the Age of Reason. The Age of Transition roughly covers the year 1740 to 1790. By 1745, the brilliant set of writers, Pope, Addison, etc., who held together the classical ideas, were no longer holding the literary domain. Classicism still continued to rule but lacked brilliance and sureness of the past generation of writers and poets. New inspirations are now welling forth but are not yet strong enough to bring about a renovation. Thus, the age is one of mixed character, and as a period of transition, we can, as readers, notice that the older idols were passing and newer ones were slowly emerging. If the classical authority and the rational spirit still hold the supremacy, the reviving forces of sentiment and middle-class literature assume large proportions till the balance is tilted in their favor in the year 1798 with the publication of the Lyrical Ballads, which marks the beginning of the Romantic period. Thus, in the works of the graveyard poets, that is Thomas Gray, Thomas Parnell, Robert Blair, or for that matter in William Cowper, William Collins, we notice a duality of opposing inspiration, and these are the poets who can be considered as the harbingers of Romantic period. So we have nearly reached the end of today's content. Before I end, I would like to sum up two dominant features of the age which are relevant to us in our reading of Gray. Firstly, two movements can be clearly observed in the writing of the time at times together, namely the allegiance to the old order of classicism and secondly the search after the new order of romanticism. Secondly, we also notice the blooming of new romanticism with four basic features. Number one, a return to nature, to the real nature of earth and air and not to the bookish nature of the artificial pastorals. Number 2, a fresh interest in man's position in the world of nature. Number 3, an enlightened sympathy for the poor and the oppressed. And number 4, a revolt against the conventional literary technique such as that of the heroic couplet. On the other hand, we see a growing desire for strength, simplicity and sincerity in the expression of the new literary idols. So I hope by now you have understood why the period to which Gray belongs is called the Age of Transition or the Pre-Romantic Age, and also the reason why Gray shares the same paper with Congreve and Defoe. Literature always becomes interesting when you can contextualize the poet and his or her works with the socio-political as well as cultural machinery at work, for it helps you to understand and form your own criticism. And that's been my purpose throughout. Hope you go back and read Gray with a new enthusiasm. So this brings us to the end of today's content. See you all again either through YouTube or in Google Meet for further discussion on Gray and his elegy. Thank you all for joining.